What's really happening to prices? Hi, I'm Richard Vague with Tycos. Inflation remains a great concern for Americans, and affordability has become the chief battle cry in political campaign after political campaign. So let's take a closer look. The new inflation numbers just came out, and if you look at the widely reported year-over-year change in CPI, November inflation was 2.7%. Moody's Analytics, particularly Chief Economist Mark Zandi, has reported significant increases in household spending due to inflation, with figures showing the typical American household spending hundreds of dollars more monthly for the same goods compared to previous years. For example, $202 more in July 23 versus July 22. More recent analysis, 2025, highlights that this increased spending power is disproportionately from the wealthiest households, while lower and middle income earners struggle, indicating growing economic inequality. Interestingly, according to the BEA, wages and salaries are up by 5% from last year. Let's look at inflation and the biggest components of the economy as reported by the BLS. Again, they're not as low as we would want, but not the earth-shattering 9% we saw in the summer of 22. If we do our own spot check of numbers supplied by other sources, the story's similar. The cost of ground beef has gone from $5.63 a pound to $6.54 a pound in the last year, a troubling 16% increase. The cost of coffee has gone from $6.87 a pound to $9.26 a pound, an unfortunate 35% increase. But the cost of bread has actually gone down from $1.92 a loaf to $1.79, a decline of 7%. And as you would expect, it is up and down and frankly all over the map for the price changes of various staples. However, one of the very most important of them is the price of gas at the pump, which according to AAA has gone from $3.03 to $2.88, a decline of 5%, and that alone has offset a lot of the bad news in other categories. In general, it's not unreasonable to think that inflation increases will be in or around that 2.5% to 3% range for the near future. So 2.7% is a level of inflation that is not as low as we would want. The Fed's target is 2%. But by itself, 2.7% inflation does not seem to be enough to cause the outcry we are clearly hearing. And most importantly, as we just referenced, we note that wages have increased in the past year more than inflation, which again calls into question this outcry. That is, until we note how unevenly distributed these wage increases are, due to a certain extent on the varying fortune of different industry sectors. And we see that variation even within a given strata of income. So it's not all the upper income getting the most raises and the lower income getting the least. There's great variations within each of those strata. This inflation story is clearly not a simple one because of this uneven distribution. To some extent, this phenomenon falls under what some are increasingly referring to as the K-shaped economy, one where there's a pronounced difference between those that are staying ahead of inflation and those that aren't. However, the level of pain we're seeing right now relates as much or more to the accumulation of inflation over the past 5 years. After the ugly COVID increases, when inflation reached as high as 9%, prices never came down. It was not unreasonable to think that if disrupted supply chains were the cause of high prices, once they were restored, prices would come back down to pre-COVID levels, or at the very least, price increases would have been negligible for a year or two. But that clearly never happened. And that's a big part of why there's so much pain. To see this vividly, let's look at the 5-year changes in price. Overall, consumer prices are up more than 25% compared to 5 years ago in many major categories: food, housing, transportation. have risen by around 30% or more. But again, note that wages are up a whopping 38%. Companies have absolutely had to respond to the impact of these price pressures on their employees. So we again have to reference the reality that is not visible in these averages. These wage increases are very unevenly distributed, to a certain extent, as mentioned, depending on the fortunes of the industries involved, and they vary significantly again, even within a given strata of income. Once again, it's the K-shaped economy, one where there is a pronounced difference between those who are staying ahead and those that aren't. So that's the big picture. But there are two big areas that deserve special attention: housing and healthcare. High home prices and rents are part of the overall challenge we are seeing. The problem has several dimensions, but one of those is low supply. The inventory of unsold homes is a low 1.4 million, well below the 2 to 2.5 million that history suggests is the appropriate level of unsold inventory. And by the way, as an aside, that number reached 4 million unsold homes in 2007, and that's why we had a global financial crisis. But at any rate, it's too low now because folks have been reluctant in that interim since then to build up unsold or speculative inventory. So part of it is simply a matter of not enough supply, and the straightforward laws of supply and demand are at play here. Prices are higher than they would otherwise be simply because the supply is too low. So incentives to build more housing, especially the ultimate incentive of lower interest rates, will have to be part of the solution. Now, increases in healthcare costs are also one of the largest components of the economy and are facing us in an unprecedented way even as we post this video. That's a subject we'll tackle when we have the courage in a future video segment. That's it for this week, and that's it for this year. We'll be off next week and back at the start of January. Thanks for your friendship. Have a happy holiday, and see you in the new year.